All right, good afternoon, everybody. It is Monday, May 18th at 2:33 p.m. My name is Thomas, and we're doing a 710 Peasants Publishing live stream recording to get put up at a later date here. We're going to be talking about a subject that is a little bit generalized. We're going to try to be as free-flowing as possible with this, and the beauty of some of these topics is that we're going to be able to pull in different threads from different places. And right now I'm trying to share up a little slide here that brings up some opportunities for people to see some of the symbols, some of the deities, some of the different subjects that thread into the foreshadowing. And it used to be in times of old that they would call it globalism, they would call it communism, they would call it neoliberalism, they would call it different names, but it kind of boiled down to the same scourge. And it came, from the church. Churches started to establish the feudal lordships. Feudal lordships gave way to congresses and legislatures. Legislatures gave way to full-on governments, where you tried to separate the powers into what we perceive, what we live under today, which is a government that has three different branches of power, and that the different roles that take place underneath those branches act to keep those powers separated. And so when you look at the slide, you come into things that are not so savory, such as human sacrifice and mystic rituals. You have things that are what we perceive to be from times of old, which is like worship of deities, this simple common prayer. But when you look around and you start seeing the actual symbols that are built in marble, see the different state buildings and things like that, you understand that it's happening, in real time, in reality, right around us. And so the cognitive dissonance that takes place inside of people is pretty severe. Different people react in different ways, generally with anger and with it's fear, and that's why they tend to refer to it as the kingdom of fear. But once you start addressing some of these larger topics, you tend to get angry and you tend to feel powerless. And so there's like this overwhelming sense of apathy that there's really nothing that you can do to change the status quo. There's so many people that are walking around completely taken asunder with the mystic ritual, with the deity worship, with all of these different day-to-day goings-ons. And it can feel powerless, but the more that you get on the internet and the more that you see material that is going counter to that, you start meeting other people that are thinking in a different way, that they've tapped out of the mainstream narratives, and that there's more and more people now that the global system has kind of screeched to a halt. There's more and more people taking time to make time to start to understand these subjects that they've avoided for so long because they've been so busy. And that's kind of what we're going to be doing today, is to get into the real meaty part of the contemporary narrative so that you can thread it back into the subjects that you see on this slide. What is a part of the human sacrifice? What is part of the mystic ritual? What is part of the crusade? And so I've done a couple of videos here now called Censored Rona, did another series called The Pillars of Columbia, and that has more to do with the mystic ritual side of it. And it puts the context of the mercy and comfort with the Navy ships, and then brings the different pillars into the contemporary narrative. And with this little monologue today, we're going to be hopefully bringing together some things that you'll recognize here. I want to talk initially here about Operation Lockstep. And I think that the term lockstep is not so well known, but lockdown is. People have been in lockdown now since March the 13th. And so we're quite a long ways into this. We're looking at First Amendment abridgment. And what's happening is that the media is actually bringing along the people to ask for more and more and more of the penetration into the private jurisdiction. And this is me saying private jurisdiction as though it exists today. It really doesn't. But the truth is that we have, specific narrative being dispelled through TV and internet that is getting people to allow even more penetration into our daily lives. And so I just want to go through some of these groups that are willfully bringing more and more of the government intervention. QAnon is at the top of the list. This is a daughter lodge of the Anon thing that has been with us since 9/11. There is seemingly a never-ending thing of posts on the internet inside of either Reddit or in the chants that get people to try to thread themselves into this digital LARPing activity where they look for news articles, they look for quotes, they look for Twitter posts that have to do with what they're seeing within the Anon chants. You have people who are taking vaccinations their whole lives and are, more than willing to go along for the ride with this new chapter in their life. You have the American people who are actually signing up to snitch on their neighbors, the people who are signing up to be contact tracers. You have cops who are busting people. You have the politicians who are enabling the whole change in our daily lives. And then you have, of course, the people who are Bill Gates fanboys, the individuals who think that he's actually working to help people to live longer, more fruitful lives. And so you wrap all of those people together and you have what's called an MKULTRA savior complex, where they believe that the government or Bill Gates or the various letter agencies that fit underneath the Patriot Act emergency clauses are actually working to save them or to mitigate harm. But really what it is Operation Lockstep. And if we're going to cover a little bit about that in these slides here, it just really is kind of concerning that Americans at any age, 21 and older, don't at face reject Bill Gates being a part of any type of global policy or global study or any of that. This is an individual who has monopolized software and computing for a very, very long time. And so, it's a very bizarre thing to watch people just take such a apathetic or accepting position within the narrative that's getting doled out, where he's able to talk, his wife's able to talk, they're able to dole out money everywhere, and so he's just a Mr. Moneybags that gets to do what he wants to do based on the influence he wields. So we stay on the money subject here for a moment, and we talk about how the government now is in a position of helicopter money. But the theater that's taking place is that people are actually thinking that it is the government doing this. Well, unfortunately, that all ended on March the 13th. And we have what's called the emergency plan, the Stafford Act being brought and issued. We have the CARESACT being issued. And so now the Treasury is in a retitling transition phase. And there is a buffer between the Department of Treasury, Department of Justice, the legislature itself, all the committees that have to do with doling out these huge amounts of helicopter money. And so you have this entity called BlackRock that is one of the biggest capital holdings entities in the world, and is a long time affiliate of the Rothschild complex. And so this is no longer the US government. When you look back into the history of the country, you have a year call of 1913 where the Federal Reserve overtook the Treasury. And so from that point forward, you no longer have a US government. And the same thing is happening in 2020. This is all new territory. We're not in Kansas anymore. And so the media and everything has a huge role to play in allowing people to think that we're still under three branches of government. We're still rolling along, as though the executive is, calling the shots. This is not the case anymore. And so I brought this photo of the United Nations altar room, where they actually have a black rock sitting in a room where the light is put above the or behind the facade there, and there's a tapestry that's the same dimensions as the rock. And so there's just this really interesting altar room sitting in the United Nations that is made of a specific substance. It's black. It's a rock. And so a lot of people forget this. This has been in the UN building for a long time. One of the hardest things to accept right now is that the American people were brought under an emergency government as of March 13th. However, a representative from the Democratic Party in Connecticut brought forward the CARESACT, which is HR 748, on January the 24th. And so it's just really, really difficult to have had, been brought forward through this whole narrative for several months, when the politicians, A, were notified, B, were allowed to do a bunch of activity on Wall Street to indemnify themselves against any type of major fluctuations in the market, but also to have a responsibility to not sing anything and to let the media notify people of what's going on, instead of them going to Twitter or, essentially going on the media and saying, hey, this is what I was told in a subcommittee meeting or what have you. And so this creates, at least for me, I can only speak for myself, this creates cognitive dissonance for me, because I do not trust the government, but I also have a big problem with huge pieces of legislation being brought forward in the moment of the most distress. This CARES Act is more or less on the level with the Patriot Act. And so we're looking at something that, Patriot Act has a bizarre name, right? And CARES Act is a bizarre name. But what you notice with these acts is that they generally are inverse to what they are. If it says cares, if it's supposed to care about you, well, that is, it's tyrannizing your reality. It's a hegemonic, autocratic, fascist system. If it's a Patriot Act, well, then it goes against the very fabric of your culture's principles and pillars. And so there's this very interesting inverse relationship between the name and what it's going to do. And so if we go down here, it says this bill responds to the COVID-19 outbreak and its impact on the economy, public health, state, local governments, individuals, and businesses. So you notice that this line reads out just like the 10th Amendment, because it starts at the national, which is the economy, the public health, and then it goes to the state, then it goes to the local, and then any individuals, and the businesses. So it's just like the 10th Amendment. It just trickle down. This is for every single fractal of our civic reality, of our government. And so people are kind of on a fast track of education here, where we're seeing the media use in language. We're seeing these bills use a different language. We've got, local codes and statutes that use a different language than what we use in our house. And so you have this contrast between words and terms. And so you have the English language, and then you have legalese. And the uh, quote that comes from the Nag Hammadi, I believe it is, says, "If you fast, you will give rise to sin for yourselves, and if you pray, you will be condemned, and if you give alms, you will do harm to your spirits. When you go into any land and walk about in the districts, if they receive you, eat what they will set before you, and heal the sick among them. For what goes into your mouth will not defile you, but that which issues from your mouth, it is that which will defile you." And so that's talking about the whole essence of sin, and talking about really the only way to sin is to have something issue from your mouth that is not held in truth, or is not actually true for you. And so the whole idea that you're going to tell someone how to live their life, or how to eat, or what to eat, codify their existence, it's all extra constitutional, but it's also extra natural. It defiles natural law. And when you go into a new land, it's that you get to enjoy the diversity of culture. You get to go and experience how other people do things. And to go where someone else lives and tell them how to live is one of the most tyrannical human endeavors that you can set about to do. And so just forget about the action of trying to force someone to do something. Just saying it, just having it issue from your mouth is a problem. And so that's what these new CARESACT and different local codifications, it's just a defiling of all of us. And so people are kind of on a fast track to learn the difference between what is, the citizens code versus natural law. And it's like, if you're born as a human, you have a domain from which you can operate from within, and that's always there for you. It's like a garden that you can always revert back to. Well, a lot of people are not educated that even exists, so they're stuck in this matrix of terminology, the matrix of codification. And that's kind of where you get enough people stuck in that becomes the more prominent primary reality. And that's the prominent matrix. And that's where you're seeing people that want to be exiles from that become disparaged of their rights, because they're the super minority. And that's where making an example of them then becomes useful. So now with the anti-vax, they've created a huge group of people to be exiles. And so this whole grouping of people who are choosing to be outside of this reality that is made up of terms and codifications has just gotten much larger. So to try to make an example of them has just become much harder. The term or word concubine here, it is a word in the context that we're looking at it here. It's not in any type of legal narrative, but it's a woman who cohabits with a man without the authority of a legal marriage, or a woman who is kept for lewd purposes, or mistress. A wife of inferior condition, a lawful wife, but not united to the man by the usual ceremonies. It's an inferior condition. The narrative here in America is that you have a person who's born and then quickly made into a citizen through the paperwork trail. And from that point forward, they have the choice to use that name in relationship to a service, or in relationship to a contract that allows for a service or an activity to happen, approbate activity. And so the term concubine then becomes relative to your relationship, because a citizen does not have rights under the context that most people think it does. And so what you're doing is you're thinking that you're a citizen with rights and acting like a live being that would be exercising their duties as a person who's acting in full faith and credit, when really you're prostituting your name that you do not own, and then becoming a concubine of a larger system of essentially what is usury and prostitution and necromancy. And so it says to lie together, to lie down. And so there's this whole gross underbelly to using fear to get people to sign up for a test and to send their name down a stream that will then get processed and then sent back with a green or a red next to it, whether they've got something or you don't have something. And so from that point forward, you're in the database. And that's where same happens when you sign up for the check, the helicopter money. Same thing happens when you sign up for the driver's license. Same thing happens when you do your taxes at the end of the year. So there's this kind of like recycling of the name back into the system. And we move on here to the narrative of the Event 201, which exercised all this out last fall. And the creepy guy, Bill Gates, was involved with this. The sad reality is Fauci is on Bill Gates' board of directors of pandemic such and such and such. And so there's this gross overlap of this, event, which does a pretend, where you build a fort and then you pretend something is happening. All right. When adults do that, you can guess that there's some magic happening, because I've already showed how there's pillars involved, and the pillars generate the walls of the circle. So inside the circle, something can happen, whereas the boundary is the walls of the circle. And they're showing you the circle right at the top of this thing here. It's like a global thing. And so they're using the whole world now as the circle from where the magic can happen within. And this is something that nobody can really argue with, because this is a globally impacting thing. And no place really, except for the most remote people, are unaffected by this. And so you look at this website and you notice here that they're using all of these models to talk about the communication and the financing and the medical countermeasures and stuff like that. And so you clearly see that Bill Gates has a relationship to both the cause and the conflict and the solution. So there's like this Hegelian narrative taking place, and this rich guy has his fingers wrapped up into all three pies, which is, you got this thing that causes fear. You have, this obvious cause-effect relationship that the fear is having. That's the conflict. And then you have the solution, which is, to a lot of government politicians, they're saying that nothing can be normal again until people have this vaccination. So there's this like shot that you're going to take that's going to give you this solution.
Thomas, can I add?
Yeah, beautiful. Go ahead.
Yeah, looking at the other day, looking at this Event 201, to me, it's like there's so many things that are right in front of our face, but we don't see them. And not to negate anything that you said about the Event 201, but what is an event? An event is showing you a plan. It's showing you an agenda. And if you look at the logo for Event 201, it's the 2, then the Earth, and then a 1. There isn't a literal 0 there. It's just an Earth stuck into the picture. So what do you have? You have Agenda 21 right in your face, and so many people aren't seeing it. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Bob.
that's a really good point. The foreshadowing has to be understood, so that when you're looking at something, it's like that you can tell your brain that although you're seeing it in the right now as an awake person, it's foreshadowing something that's supposed to have yet occurred. And we think of this event 201, it had already happened in the past, but it's foreshadowing something that's supposed to come in the future yet. And although you bring that point up that there's kind of like a 2-1, just using the number science, it's like 2 is duality, 1 is unity. And one of the most universal threads in eugenics, universal threads in the globalism movement is that they're bringing all of these different nationalities into one global system. And so that this also is foreshadowing a little bit of that. One thing too that I hate to do this, but I did this presentation on the Pillars of Columbia, and that there's this narrative of a pallid yellow, and they're everywhere you look, like yield signs and caution signs, are always of a pallid yellow, whether it be an actual yellow tint or an orange tint. It always has to do with taking red and then adding in different hues until you get this pallid yellow color. And so right here again, we're working with all these little viruses spiraling around the big globe, and it's all of a pallid yellow tint. This slide more or less is just offering people an opportunity to see how coinage plays a major part in the magical relationship of what's going on. One meme that is circulating around both on Twitter and Facebook is the new coins that they issued that has the bats on them. And the quarters obviously have always been used as the platform for featuring national parks and different geographical locations. And this is kind of in that same thread. However, out of all the places that they could have chosen, all the animals that they could have chosen to feature in the year 2020, people are kind of like having a little portion of cognitive dissonance occur when they see that it's a bat, when the initial narrative that was put out by the Communist Party was that this is a wet market issue, and that the whole thing could have been avoided if they would have just contained the contamination of wet markets in general. And going on here, we have the cover of a book that is probably not as well known as the pandemic videos that are going around. We really do live in a culture now where videos and YouTube are taking the centerpiece of people's focus instead of actual text publications like books and PDFs and stuff like that. But this Arthur Furstenberg put together a read that has to do with the narrative of the stratosphere having this electrical blanket, and every time that we upgrade our human capacity for satellites or antenna or any form of transpondence of electromagnetic radiation, it plays into the greater envelope of global electromagnetic blanketing. And so the Spanish flu pandemic was right in line with a major change in the human potential of the corresponders, transpondence, where you have ascending and receiving unit. And UHF and FM and AM and UHF all have different modalities that they work within. And now with the digital realm and 5G, the millimeter wave radiation is altogether different than where we started. And so the human body is in relationship to this blanket, and the major you call it this, I was going to call it the space companies, the major space agencies like NASA and the Russian Sputnik system, they learn this very, very harshly by sending someone into orbit. And then once they get beyond a certain altitude from the core of the Earth, they no longer are able to maintain, because there's a magnetic electromagnetic blanket that they pass beyond. And so they had to literally engineer a device that stays on their suit and creates the same electromagnetic blanket that the Earth provides. The harsh reality is that the physical changes that a monkey, a primate, or a human undergoes when they leave that blanket, they forget who they are. It's like a digital solid state drive getting wiped. It's really something that shows you that our brains and our central nervous system is very, very closely related and interrelated to the global electromagnetic blanket. And this book goes into the timeline of how people's bodies and minds have been more and more intensely blanketed in EMF radiation. And that the more or less positives that it's actually harder to be human in 2020 than it is in the beginning of the 1900s, because there is all this artificial radiation blanketing us all the time. And so just to be natural and just to be human takes so much more effort than it would have in the past. And so that's kind of an interesting meditation in and of itself, is to kind of think about how the world might be different based on these artificial inputs. We brought up this is from CNN, and I just wanted to use this because they do a really knock up job of using visuals and text to put together something that very quickly gets the point across. You've got a blue coat with a red tie and a white shirt. All right, you got all the houses of Egypt brought here. You got the presidential emblem on the front of his podium. You got the dude standing behind him with the blue shirts and different colored ties and tints. And really all they're there to do is to issue the announcement that the Stafford Act has been brought forth. And this is being done inside of the Rose Garden. All right, so you already have this fruit that is forbidden narrative, but they're saving us. So you have to realize that whatever's being issued here is for your own good. It's actually saving you. So what does it do? Well, it puts FEMA in the driver's seat. It puts the CDC in a administrator position. HHS will remain the lead agency directing a federal response. And so you got all these guys called FEMA administrators who are stockpiling commodities all across the country. And so, as Brian had just mentioned, this Agenda 21 stuff was already spilled long time ago. That was something that people were talking about over a decade ago, and now we're seeing that there's actually like a platform now for a lot of these resources to be brought forward. And so, Stafford Act is what it is. You can go read that for yourself, but the actual bottom line is that Federal Emergency Management Agency is extra constitutional. It's extracurricular. It does not fall under the private domain of the yeomanry. There is a whole bunch of people that live in the 50 states that this does not apply to. But when you read an article like this, you're like, oh my goodness, well, the guy who's got the emblem in front of him is issuing this thing, so it must apply to me. So we're all sitting out here going, okay, well, the United States is now under an emergency. Well, stop calling it that. It's no longer that. It's the FEMA states. It's no longer a system of three branches of government. We're under, what would be in the pre-Civil War times as the emergency plan that they issued then. It's now evading me. Hopefully this will pop into my head, but it's the Abraham Lincoln's little emergency plan that brought everything under a codified existence, the LEIBER code. There we go. It's the LEIBER code. And so you could just call this the FEMA code. FEMA and LEIBER, it's synergistic. And that's kind of where we go along here. And, it instigates fear. It instigates a need for people to conform, not to question their authority. But let's continue on here. There's another one here. It says Trump declares national emergency, and this is after he's denying responsibility for the testing failures. Well, set aside the subject of the testing. The testing is being used to distract people. What we're really needing to pay attention to is the helicopter money and the restructuring of the government. And, it's kind of like a thing where these live press releases are supposed to, like they say right in this article, it says air of competence. It's supposed to output an air of competence, but then the media makes him look completely incompetent by asking him, questions about what he said previously. Totally goes against what he's now going with, and it's just like all of this arrogance on his part just creates this demoralizing effect on the American people. It doesn't matter what type of political affiliation you have, or what type of values you have, or what your pillars are for American culture. This is all very, very demoralizing. And so the whole point of the fear in all of the extra is to demoralize people. Everything, whether it be anger or mistrust or just outright fear, it demoralizes you. And so that's kind of where, once people are demoralized, they're far more willing to submit to crazy demands that have to do with the codification of our reality. And that's where the obey aspect of all of this starts to come in. This slide really drives home the horrible overlap between Malthusian eugenics, the Fabian socialism, Nazi nationalism, techno Fabian fascism with the IBM Microsoft connection. And then as we get into the whole vaccination of Planned Parenthood, the government is lockstep in with these, globalists. And so you see, long-standing programs to run tests on people when the tests are just a cover story for running a research program to see what happens to the human body given a certain input. And we see evidence of this over and over and over and over and over. And so having Bill Gates circling around your COVID-19 narrative should be cause for concern for anyone. And his background with the parents having to do with both the Federal Reserve and Planned Parenthood, it overlaps the whole banker syndicate, corporate syndicate, and then global Bilderberg syndicate. It really, really, really is cause for concern in that, I just did another episode of the Pillars of Columbia, bringing forward the different historic. It's a really weird timeline and narrative between the Catholic Church and the celebrity culture, and that they brought forward Tom Hanks underneath Bill Gates and Fauci. So there's some connections for the general populace to make. There is that Tom Hanks is now being used much in the same way that Ronald Reagan and Newt Rockney was used. And so the Newt Rockney was one of the four horsemen, and so he was killed in a pneumonia situation, and so it's just being used as foreshadowing and overlap for current events. And this slide is really excellent to give people the side by side for the kingdom of fear. There is trace services, contact tracing services being arranged in your state as we speak. And the more apathetic people are, the more this is just going to go forward, and they're going to literally pay people by the hour to be involved in a government situation that literally should not even exist. And it's kind of where, if you're docile, if you're trusting, if you're going along with the narrative that we've got a massive, massive problem on our hands, then this is something where you might think of the CARES Act and the Trace Act as something that will help you. Well, um, look at all these things where it says you're trading freedom for safety. It's the same on both sides. The slogan now is the new normal, whereas before it was never forget. And the TV is always giving out a different narrative than what individuals are saying on the social networking platforms. That should trouble you right there. The more that individuals sound different than the narrative on your TV, that should be cause for major cognitive dissonance. But there's a PDF that was put out by the Rockefeller Foundation, and it outlines absolutely everything that's taking place today, both at a global level, at a national level, state level, local county level. And we're all familiar with the term lockdown because the whole idea of quarantine was blanketed across the land. Well, you don't quarantine healthy people, you quarantine sick people. You don't lock down free people, you lock down criminals. And so there's this terminology that's getting blanketed across the land, and people are just kind of like absorbing it without having a conscious connection to what it's doing to them. Well, lockstep, let's read it. A world of tighter top-down government control and more authoritarian leadership with limited innovation and growing citizen pushback. This is what you would see in China if people were less docile. They have all of the aspects of government control and authoritarian, but they don't have the whole smart scramble aspect of this. So let's read Smart Scramble. An economically depressed world in which individuals and communities develop localized makeshift solutions in a growing set of problems. So you just don't see that in China because of how actual powerful and authoritarian the central system is. So let's keep reading here. We got Hack Attack, which is an economically unstable and shock-prone world in which governments weaken, criminals thrive, and dangerous innovations emerge. So this is kind of where they're giving you an opportunity to slip into fear, just like in post 9/11, where we have sleeper cells, we have guy with the shoes that could blow up. We got all these opportunities to turn on the news and see the reasons for being in fear. And so this opportunity to go in the direction of the hack attack is supposedly very real. And then you have Clever Together, a world in which highly coordinated and successful strategies emerge for addressing both urgent and entrenched worldwide issues. So that's the holding hands, the blue globe here. It's very, very much the ideal panacea, cornucopia of everybody, working together to lift up the world. And so you have this very, very bizarre four-way diagram that's kind of showing people this foreshadowing of, they're going to give you flavors of propaganda that are going to push segments of the populace in all of these directions. Every single type of personality and archetype deals with fear in a different way. And so this middle pillar here, this middle part of this says political and economic alignment. Are they strongly aligned with the central system, or are they loosely aligned with it? And so as you go down this middle pillar, you have people acting under their own authority, acting individually. And then here in the middle, you have adaptive capacity. All right. And that's where if someone's highly adaptive and acting in their own capacity, you have them being way down on the bottom and lower right, where they're able to scramble, they're able to be smart about it, they're able to be, essentially as versatile as they need to be. So let's go on here, because this just kind of is a whole little, quagmire of information in itself. But this is from the same PDF booklet that they brought out with the whole lockstep, a world of tighter top-down government control. And you can go ahead and read this, but it talks about the influenza strain originating from wild geese. It's virulently deadly. 20% of the global population, 8 million, 7 months, da 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 da. It's a Orwellian readout. This is called fear porn. And I'm not going to get deep into this because I'm just trying to set an example with it. Here's the cover booklet of it. See the little ripple in the map of the globe here, and then you got this putrid green aqua color Rockefeller Foundation at the bottom, where it's the O in Rockefeller is a smaller circle with the same putrid aqua color, and all of the land is made of zeros and ones. So the digital binary is being played out here. Just giving you the foreshadowing. This slide is another quagmire of information. If you go into the World Economic Forum website and open up the Strategic Intelligence portal, you can sign up to be able to wormhole into this data bank of different things that, subjects that you can search and everything. And this is the Panopticon. This allows you to find any type of media that's related to the mindset that there is a scourge, then there's a conflict, and then there is a solution. So there's three different things happening here, and it's up to you to have your brain wrap around this, because there's a lot of information, there's a lot of things happening all at once. And so this tool is set aside for you to educate yourself, educate other people, But what is the World Economic Forum? Well, it's a subsidiary of the WHO. And WHO is a supranational government in and of itself. This is speaking to the same entity, which is WHO. It's coronavirus training simulation exercise. This breaks out the whole, they call it the COVID-19 SIM-X, to examine and strengthen existing plans, procedures, capabilities. So this is the magic. This is where they took people from the problem, conflict, solution, and then, figured out if they had enough of a package put together so that it would be polished enough so that when it happened for real, nobody would be, having that Truman effect where it's like, man, this all seems so packaged. It seems so shiny and bullshitty that, I almost can't believe it. So it's funny with this slide. If you go down to the bottom here, it literally says simulation package. Do you want it in PowerPoint form? Do you want it in PDF form? You got a participant's guide, someone who's facilitating the simulation. It's just really, it almost kind of makes it feel gross almost, where it's just like, hey, here you go. We've been training for this our whole lives. And so the narrative here that's going to get people to become angry, become disenfranchised, to be confused enough that they're starting to not be able to talk to their community members. They're starting to not feel at home with what the leaders of their community are saying. Everything starts to break down. Everything starts to become counter to what you're seeing within your own, your own reality. And, there's a scene in the Matrix movie where Morpheus offers the red pill, he takes the red pill, and then within a few moments, his face starts melting into the mirror. Well, that's what's happening at a global level right now. There's a slide that I didn't get included in on this that I had the attention to. Was a cartoon that was brought forward in the 60s, maybe back as far as early as the 50s, called Spy versus Spy. There's a black spy and a white spy, and the cartoon is very simple, and it would show how they're always trying to outdo each other, but in the end they would both, kind of undercut themselves, and neither one of them would have the upper hand. And this type of MKUltra programming, the savior complex, the let's see here if I can actually make this go to a couple other slides here. Well, that's all right. It's the idea that we're trying to get across is that the people that don't really trust the government are still accepting the Bill Gates narrative. They're still accepting the Tom Hanks narrative. They're still accepting the CARES Act and the Trace Act and all of these happening at the different levels of their government. And then you have the people who have always been trusting, and then you have people who have never been trusting, and they're all at various degrees of cognitive dissonance in this, and that sets off fear, sets off anger, sets off disorientation. And within that, we're all going online and saying, well, this is my reality. I'm now beaconing out and signaling out that this is my reality. And everybody is having to see that and say, holy cow, I'm surrounded by people who think this is the reality. Well, that's a harsh reality in of itself, is to come to grips with how splintered and balkanized we already are in our capacity to accept and perceive reality. And that's kind of getting down to one of these, horribly harsh spiritual truths, is that we're all embarking on a collective hallucination, as humans. This is all something that we're dreaming this up together, and that when we're all splintered off, you come to this conclusion that is like, oh cow, every single individual person is both experiencing their subjective individual reality as well as participating in a collective, what you call, what do you call it? It's a something matrix. It's a plural matrix. It's not a singular matrix. And the movie did a great job, because Morpheus would take Neo into these simulations where it's just him, but there's all of these computerized, individuals walking around, that gives them the ideas like, oh, they can simulate all of this. Well, kind of what's going on now, where people are like, holy cow, there's a lot of people just walking around accepting the simulated narrative, and that once I start choosing my own reality, I can no longer trust those individuals, I can no longer count on them, I can no longer listen to what defiles them when it comes out of their mouth. And it becomes isolating, it becomes even more disenfranchising and disorienting. And so at the bottom of the slide, it says words used as terms yoke us forever after in bondage. And that's one of the things that if we become in fear, we simply come back to neutral by saying that everything is built off of words. Everything that, creates fear is built off of words. And so the Wizard of Oz is literally the wizard of using the reality to create something that is, instigating an emotion in you. And, when we act in our honor, we bring ourselves back to neutral first and foremost, but we also educate ourselves as to how to deal with this change in our codified reality, how to talk to contact tracers, how to talk to cops who are trying to penetrate our jurisdiction and our self-determination. And so this is all going to be a fast tracking of people's orientation within how to speak to stay in your own honor and act on your rights. And that's kind of where there's been people studying this and working within this narrative for a long, long time, and they still don't feel completely ready to ride through the rapids in their little canoe, because there's some serious whitewater rapids, and the canoes are only so sturdy. So the water's turbulent right now, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And when you go out there and you try to be unaffiliated, you try to act in a private capacity, it's not that easy, number one, and there's not a lot out there that allows you to follow someone else. There's really a self ordained path. And the vaccination push, the push to keep kids in school where they're having to stay at home, all these changes and enforced codifications of our existence is going to make this group of people who self-exile even larger and larger and larger. And so there's, I guess, a coming to realization across the whole country is like, if we're citizens and we're being forced to do this, what do I need to be to have rights again? And, if it's not a citizen, what is it? Well, that is a very, very important question that every individual themselves will have to answer for themselves. Well, acting in private is not citizenry, it's yeomanry. And that's kind of where the private membership association and the rings within rings becomes paramount to this fast tracking of understanding of how to solidify yourself and your resources in association with other private parties. So that when it comes to the loss of your currency, the loss of your federal government and state government and the machinery that it normally operates on, you are not as impacted, and that the resources that you can bolster within your community and within your affiliations with other private parties is there to cushion you. And that's kind of a whole nother can of worms that we get into in another presentation. But who wants to associate with another person who's in fear? Who wants to associate with another person who is acting in a modality that is going to sink your canoe the moment that you start getting into any type of rapids, let alone whitewater rapids? And so when we get into that whole are you a powerful person? Are you acting in honor? Well, are you tapping into any of these artificial curated narratives that have to do with savior complex, has to do with white hat, black hat, patsy, wetware, where they're literally channeling people into thinking that this person is going to help them, another person is trying to harm them. And, I explained this a little bit in this presentation, even just bringing up Bill Gates. It's like, well, maybe you think Bill Gates is a black hat. Well, in the context that I brought it up, of course I'm saying he's a black hat. But I'm not out there saying that there is a white hat. I'm saying that the yeomanry, the private jurisdiction, is the white hat. There's no individual person that's gonna take us out of this deep level of both hypnosis and bondage. We have to do it for ourselves. And so when I start pointing out any type of patsy wetware, it's pointing to an individual person. It's a curated narrative that points to an individual person saying that they're working to better my chances of not experiencing fear, harm, or loss. And that's savior complex stuff. They're running MKUltra programming on the whole country now. The Mercy ship and the Comfort ship acted as the two buildings of 9/11, and they're put in the ports of the country to act as the pillars of the magic show. And so I'll just foreshadow some of the stuff I put in the Pillars of Columbia here and wrap this up. There's something that's going to take place in the middle of the country that has not threaded in yet. And the Flint, Michigan water pandemic has been a long-running narrative. The Standing Rock pipeline was something that erupted. There's I believe it was a killing in Missouri where racial tensions are being brought into the narrative. And so the middle of the country is going to be used in this whole narrative, and they've been foreshadowing it. Well, when you get down to the historics of Ronald Reagan and Fauci and the whole connection of both Ecosglacial Society members and celebrities and scientists, you can see that this guy who was the coach of Newt Rockne, he was killed in a plane crash over Kansas. What was the town in Kansas? It was Bizarre, Kansas. So we're kind of being brought along on a Wizard of Oz narrative here right at the same time. And something in the middle of the country is going to be implicated here. And I'm not going to necessarily say I got my finger on it yet, because I don't. But if it creates an emotional reaction in people, then you're starting to smell it and you're starting to get a sense of it. I really appreciate everybody if you've listened along this far. This is our little presentation on the MK Ultra Savior Complex and White Hat, Black Hat, Patsy, Wetware that gets threaded into people's subconscious. We covered that Event 201 slide here where they're using the pallid yellow color as well as the symbolism here to talk about Agenda 21. And this is all just foreshadowing. It's just wetware to go straight into your subconscious. And you've already got those symbols located there. You've already got the fear threaded into the previous experience that had to do with the symbols. So it's just a respiraling of all this stuff back into you again. And it's kind of a self-determined state to tap out of this. It's kind of a situation to self-exile yourself from the news and the media and all these things, because it's quite frankly, is it helping you to understand, or is it taking you further under and allowing you that when you talk to your friends, the words that come out of you are actually defiling you because you're so far off of the actual truth of things that there's really not a lot you can do for yourself. But with that, I appreciate people following along this long. This is a situation that we've never experienced in our life, and the apathy, the believability of all this is something that it troubles everybody. It's troubling to see how much people are being taken along for a ride here and in eating the narrative instead of saying, you know what, none of these dates line up, none of the facts line up, and none of the actions that the government is taking correspond to the dangers that are set before us. So, the more people talk to each other, the more people use their online resources to put out their personal reality, that's very powerful. And so with that, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. I want to thank you and say that until next time, we're gonna keep on doing these until something gives, until the levee breaks. So I appreciate it. We'll catch you next time.